You are not a real journalist. You are a liar. He's not real. He's agile. He's real. Get him off this plane. He doesn't belong here.
What would you do if you boarded a plane, quietly taking your seat, only to be accused of a crime you never committed? What if whispers of suspicion turned into shouts of certainty, not because of your actions, but because of the color of your skin? On a routine flight meant to take him to his dying mother's side, Senator Julian Hart found himself at the center of a storm no one could have predicted. A first-class cabin, a wealthy couple pointing fingers, officers called, passengers watching in silence, and one man calm, steady, holding on to his dignity even as the world tried to strip it away. But here's the question that will haunt you if he hadn't revealed his true identity as a United States Senator. What would have happened? Would he have been dragged off in handcuffs? Would anyone have cared? This is not just a story about humiliation at 30,000 feet. It's about silence. It's about dignity. And it's about what happens when prejudice is forced into the light. Stay with us. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear will change the way you see the world. The soft hum of the terminal filled the air like background music, blending with the clatter of rolling suitcases and the faint aroma of roasted coffee drifting from a kiosk nearby. Senator Julian Hart adjusted the strap of his worn leather bag on his shoulder, walking slowly toward Gate C-17 of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall glass panes, streaking across the polished floor, catching faces in hurried motion. To anyone watching, Julian looked like just another traveler, a tall black man in a navy polo shirt, jeans, and comfortable shoes. No staff entourage, no security detail, no tailored suit screaming power. He preferred it that way. Today was not about politics or cameras or speeches. Today was about family. His mother, Evelyn Hart, was lying in a hospital bed in Washington, D.C., her health slipping further with each call from his sister. Every minute mattered. Julian reached the gate, handed his boarding pass to the smiling agent, and heard the quiet beep of approval. "Have a safe flight, Mr. Hart," she said without recognition, her eyes already moving to the next passenger. "Thank you," Julian replied with a polite nod. The short jet bridge funneled him into the gleaming cabin of North Star Air Flight 719 bound for Washington. The scent of new leather and disinfectant hung in the air, mixed with the subtle perfume of first-class luxury. The overhead lights glowed a soft amber, and chilled champagne glasses were already waiting on polished trays. Julian found his seat 2A, by the window. He slid his bag into the overhead compartment and lowered himself into the plush leather seat. A sigh of relief escaped him. For the first time all morning, he allowed himself to close his eyes, to imagine sitting beside his mother later today, holding her fragile hand. But peace in first class rarely lasts long. From the corner of his vision, Julian noticed a couple stepping into the cabin with the kind of presence that demanded attention. Gregory Mercer, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a tailored suit with cufflinks that caught the light. His wife, Elaine Mercer, followed close behind, draped in a silk scarf, her diamond earrings glinting as though they had their own spotlight. Their conversation was loud, their movements precise, their expectations unspoken but clear. The cabin belonged to them. Julian opened his eyes fully as they settled into seats 3A and 3B directly behind him. Gregory complained about the boarding process, while Elaine wrinkled her nose at the champagne. Their voices carried forward, a subtle reminder that entitlement had its own volume. Flight attendant Ava Delgado moved gracefully down the aisle, checking passengers and offering warm greetings. She paused by Julian's row, her smile professional but slightly nervous, as though she had been warned to treat every situation delicately. "Welcome aboard, sir. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff? Water's fine." "Thank you," Julian said, his voice calm, measured. As Ava walked away, Julian felt the weight of being watched. A fleeting glance backward confirmed it. The Mercers' eyes were on him. He had grown used to such looks, the quick assessments, the unspoken questions about whether he belonged. It wasn't anger that rose in him now, but a familiar heaviness, a sense of rehearsing patience. The rest of the cabin filled quickly. A young man, barely 18, slipped in his seat 4C with earbuds dangling from his neck. His phone screen glowed bright. His thumbs moved fast. Julian caught only a glimpse, but sensed the boy's attention darted everywhere. Eager, restless, always ready to record the world. The captain's voice soon cut through the low chatter. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Peter Caldwell, and I'll be taking you to Washington National today. Weather is clear all the way, and we're expecting a smooth flight of about 1 hour and 15 minutes. Sit back, relax, and let our crew take care of you." The announcement drew polite smiles and nods, but Julian's focus drifted back inward. His phone buzzed, a text from his sister. "She's awake, asking for you." Julian swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He typed back quickly, "Boarding now. I'll be there soon. Tell her I love her." For a moment, he felt like any other son rushing to his mother's side. Politics, power, and public life meant nothing compared to that. He leaned his head back, exhaling slowly, willing time to move faster. But life had a way of turning simple flights into crucibles. As the last passenger settled, the Mercers' voices grew louder again. Elaine mentioned something about the standards of first class, while Gregory chuckled, casting a glance toward the front rows. Julian ignored them, his eyes fixed on the safety card in the seat pocket. He could already sense where their energy might go, though he prayed he was wrong. The engines rumbled beneath them, the plane shuddering gently as it pushed back from the gate. Julian closed his eyes again, whispering a quiet prayer for strength, for patience, for dignity. He had lived long enough to know that dignity could be tested at the most unexpected moments. The seatbelt sign chimed. The runway stretched out ahead, and with a burst of force, North Star Air Flight 719 lifted into the clear Georgia sky toward Washington, toward his mother, toward something he could not yet name. Julian looked out the window at the shrinking city below. He did not know that within this very cabin, at 30,000 feet, a storm of accusation and injustice was already brewing, waiting to challenge everything he believed about humanity, prejudice, and the price of silence. The champagne sparkled in crystal glasses. The voices behind him grew sharper. The air in first class thickened with expectation. And Senator Julian Hart, unrecognized in his plain clothes, sat steady in his seat, unaware that before this flight landed, his name would ignite headlines across the nation. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude. A gentle chime followed, and flight attendant Ava Delgado moved down the aisle with practiced ease. Her smile was warm, but her eyes scanned the cabin with a kind of alertness only years in the skies could teach. First class was often calm, but it was also where egos were at their sharpest. She knew the Mercers by reputation. She had seen their names on the manifest and braced herself the moment they boarded. Julian adjusted the seatbelt across his waist, loosening it just enough to breathe easier. The hum of the engines filled the silence as he opened his book, a worn paperback with creases along the spine. He had read it many times, but today the words on the page blurred. His mind was in Washington, beside his mother. Behind him, the Mercers settled into a rhythm of complaint. Gregory muttered about the quality of the champagne, insisting it had lost its chill. Elaine scolded Ava for taking too long to bring her a second glass. When Ava apologized politely, Elaine waved her off with a dismissive flick of her manicured hand. Julian lowered his book, sighed quietly, and forced himself to focus on the words. Yet his ears caught every phrase that carried forward, words sharpened not by volume but by tone. The Mercers' presence was a performance loud enough for those around them to notice, calculated enough to assert ownership of the space. Across the aisle, a woman in her 40s watched carefully. Dr. Layla Chen, a sociologist returning from a conference, had an instinct for noticing dynamics like this. She adjusted her glasses and jotted a note in the small journal she carried everywhere. To her, the Mercers were not just irritating passengers. They were data points in a pattern she had studied for years. A few rows back, Miles Parker leaned against the window, phone angled discreetly. The young man wasn't recording yet, but he was ready. For his generation, every moment carried the potential to go viral. He scrolled through social media, his screen reflecting faintly in the dim cabin light. While one ear remained tuned to the voices rising behind Julian, Julian tried to ignore it all. He kept his gaze on the page, though he hadn't absorbed a sentence in minutes. His fingers tapped gently on the armrest, a quiet rhythm he used to steady his thoughts. He told himself, "You are here for your mother. This flight is a bridge, nothing more. Stay calm, stay invisible." But invisibility was never truly possible. "Excuse me." Elaine Mercer's voice pierced the quiet, directed at Ava. "There's a problem." Ava turned instantly, leaning slightly toward the couple. "Of course, ma'am. What seems to be the issue?" Elaine's eyes flicked past Ava, landing squarely on Julian. Her lips pursed. "My phone," she said slowly. "It was right here when I sat down. Now it's gone." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Gregory added weight with a low grunt. "And there's only one person between us and the aisle," he said, his gaze drilling into the back of Julian's seat. Julian froze, the rhythm on his armrest stopping mid-beat. His chest tightened. He had felt this before, an accusation not yet spoken directly, but already alive in the air, crawling across the space, attaching itself to him. Ava blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sure it's just slipped between the seats or into your bag, ma'am. These compartments can be tricky." Elaine shook her head firmly. "No. I know where I put it. It's not there. Someone must have taken it." The quiet hum of the cabin shifted. Heads turned. Breaths caught. The performance was working. Julian placed his book carefully on the tray table, folded his hands, and waited. He would not speak first. He had learned long ago that silence could be both shield and weapon. "Dr. Chen sat straighter, pen still in hand, eyes locked on the scene unfolding. She sensed the danger of escalation. She sensed, too, the familiar script of privilege and suspicion, and the particular way it played out when directed at someone who looked like Julian. Behind her, Miles Parker lowered his phone slightly, thumb hovering over the record button. He had been waiting for a story to find him. He suspected one had just arrived. Ava leaned closer to the Mercers, her voice low but audible. "Let's not jump to conclusions. I'll help you look. Sometimes items shift during boarding. Gregory scoffed. Look, my wife isn't careless. If her phone is missing, it's missing for a reason. And the only logical explanation is that the man in front of us decided to help himself. Julian inhaled slowly, measured, his shoulders rising and falling with deliberate calm. He did not turn around. He did not respond. His mind whispered patience. Always patience. But patience had limits. He could feel his pulse quicken, the old frustration stirring beneath his ribs. How many times had he endured this dance? The burden of proving innocence placed squarely on his shoulders before a word was spoken in his defense. Elaine pressed harder. "Excuse me," she said, her voice now aimed at Julian. "You're sitting right in front of us. Did you happen to see a phone?" Her question carried the tone of accusation cloaked as politeness. The eyes of the cabin bore into him, waiting for his response. Julian turned his head slowly, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were steady, his voice even. "No, ma'am. I didn't see your phone." Elaine's lips tightened. "Are you sure?" Julian held her stare. "I am." The exchange was brief, but its weight was immense. The tension crackled like static, ready to spark. Captain Caldwell's voice broke through overhead, announcing minor turbulence ahead. The seatbelt sign illuminated, but no one in first class was thinking about turbulence now. Ava bent down discreetly, searching under the Mercer's seats. She retrieved nothing. Elaine crossed her arms, shaking her head. Gregory leaned forward, voice low but audible enough for those nearby. "Some people don't belong up here. That's the problem." Julian closed his eyes again, not from fatigue, but from restraint. His mind drifted to his mother, fragile and waiting. He thought of her lessons, of dignity carried through storms. He thought of the oath he had taken in office to serve with honor, to uphold justice. Yet here he was, a son and a senator, cornered in a leather seat at 30,000 feet, accused without evidence. He opened his eyes, steady once more. Whatever came next, he would not let it shatter him. The cabin grew quieter, the kind of silence that signaled anticipation. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. Julian Hart sat tall in 2A, the storm gathering behind him, unaware of just how far the Mercers would go to prove their narrative true, and unaware, too, that the quiet boy with the phone in row 4 had just tapped record. The plane had leveled out at 33,000 feet, gliding smoothly through a sky so blue it almost seemed painted. But inside the first-class cabin of North Star Flight 7119, the air was taut with something far heavier than turbulence. Elaine Mercer leaned forward in her seat, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the armrest. Her eyes stayed fixed on Julian's back. Her lips pursed in a line that told everyone she had already chosen her story. Gregory sat beside her, arms crossed, his jaw tight with performative indignation. "Flight attendant," Elaine called, her voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the engines. Ava Delgado hurried forward, heart already racing. She had been trained to manage difficult passengers, but there was a peculiar dread in the way the Mercers commanded the space, as though the cabin bent to their will. "Yes," Ma'am Ava asked, keeping her voice steady. Elaine didn't lower her voice. "I'm telling you, my phone has been stolen, and if it's not under these seats, then it must have been taken by him." She extended her perfectly manicured finger toward Julian. Every head in first class turned, eyes flicking from Elaine to Julian like spectators at a tennis match. Even in silence, the accusation rang louder than the engines. Julian slowly placed his book on the tray table once more. He had been reading the same paragraph for nearly 20 minutes, not because the words were difficult, but because he had felt this exact moment approaching. He inhaled, long and deep, before turning in his seat. His voice was calm, his tone even. "I've already told you, ma'am. I haven't seen your phone." Gregory leaned forward now, his broad frame pushing against the seatbelt. "Look, just admit it. We saw you shift around when we were boarding. Maybe you thought no one noticed, but we did." The lie struck Julian like a slap. His heart thudded in his chest, but outwardly he remained composed. He had faced smear campaigns, political attacks, even hate mail delivered to his Senate office. But this was something far older and more personal. The familiar weight of being presumed guilty, not for what he had done, but for who he was. "I shifted because I was putting my bag away," Julian said, still steady. Elaine scoffed. "Convenient." A murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to intervene but unable to look away. Others exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. "Do you think he did it?" Leila Chun sat straighter, her pen scratching rapidly against the small journal in her lap. She was documenting everything: the words, the body language, the ripple of bias that spread like smoke. She knew too well that once a narrative was cast, truth often drowned beneath it. In row 4, Miles Parker's phone was no longer idle. The red dot glowed in the corner of his screen as he filmed discreetly, angling his camera just above the seat in front of him. He had been raised in a world where injustice trended, where stories broke not through newspapers, but through live streams. Something in his gut told him this moment mattered. Ava crouched beside the Mercer's row, desperation softening her voice. "Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, please, we'll do everything we can to help locate your phone. But accusing another passenger without proof, that's a serious matter," Elaine snapped back. "And what do you suggest?" "Pretend it disappeared into thin air," Gregory added. "Exactly. You think people like us make baseless accusations?" Julian's jaw tightened. The words repeated in his mind like echoes: people like us. He knew exactly what that meant, even if they didn't say it outright. He looked toward Ava now. "I respect your position," he said, his tone controlled. "But I'm not going to be searched, and I'm not going to be treated as a suspect." A hush fell across the cabin. The words landed with force, carrying the weight of someone who had spent his life choosing battles carefully. Julian's refusal was not just about dignity, it was about survival. Ava's throat tightened. She glanced at the Mercers, then back at Julian, caught in an impossible triangle. She lowered her voice, almost whispering, "Sir, maybe if you just show them your bag, it would calm things down." Julian's eyes closed briefly, his chest rising with a slow inhale. Here it was, the old dance, repeated in countless forms across his life. The demand to prove innocence, to sacrifice dignity for peace. His mind flashed to his mother, her voice in his memory: "Julian, and never let anyone take your self-respect from you. Once you give that away, they'll never stop taking." He opened his eyes again, clear and unwavering. "No," he said. "I won't do that. I don't owe them proof of anything." Elaine gasped as if he had confessed guilt. "You see, if he were innocent, he'd cooperate." Julian turned his head fully now, meeting her gaze with calm steel. "No, ma'am. Innocence does not need permission slips, and dignity is not negotiable." The words silenced even Gregory for a moment. But the silence was short-lived. Gregory slammed his palm against the armrest. "This is outrageous. Captain, someone call the captain." The call button dinged overhead. Ava's pulse raced as she reached for her intercom. She didn't want to escalate, but the Mercers left her no choice. "In the cockpit." Captain Peter Caldwell adjusted his headset, listening as Ava explained in hushed tones what had transpired. He rubbed his temple. He hated conflicts like this, especially in first class. They had a way of becoming headlines. Still, he knew the airline's manual: keep order, avoid confrontation, resolve quickly. His gut told him that meant siding with the loudest voices. When he emerged moments later, the cabin stiffened. Passengers sat straighter, eyes following him as though he were both judge and jury. His crisp uniform, the gold stripes on his shoulders, carried an authority that few dared to question. "What's the situation?" Captain Caldwell asked, his voice firm. Elaine wasted no time. "My phone has been stolen, Captain, and we know exactly who took it." She gestured again toward Julian. Caldwell's eyes shifted to Julian, assessing. A black man, casually dressed, calm but firm. A couple in expensive clothes insisting he was guilty. It wasn't hard to guess which story the captain found easier to believe. Julian met his gaze without flinching. "I told them already. Captain." "I didn't take anything." Caldwell exhaled sharply. "Sir, if you could just cooperate and allow your belongings to be checked, we can settle this quickly and move on." Julian's heart thudded louder, not from fear but from anger barely contained. He wanted to shout, to remind them of who he was, of the office he held, of the responsibility he carried. But another voice rose in his mind, his mother's again telling him that true strength often meant restraint. He straightened in his seat, his tone even but resolute. "With respect, Captain, no. I will not submit to a search simply because I've been accused. That is not justice. That is surrender." The cabin was silent now, every passenger holding their breath. Even the engine seemed muted beneath the weight of his words. "Doctor," Chen wrote furiously, capturing every detail. Miles's camera caught every second, the angle imperfect, but the story undeniable. Elaine's face flushed with outrage. Gregory's voice boomed, demanding justice, demanding order, demanding compliance, and Julian Hart, seated in 2A, felt the storm fully upon him. His pulse quickened. His mind raced with the weight of choice. Stay silent and endure humiliation, or stand tall and risk escalation. Inside him, two truths battled fiercely, the son desperate to reach his mother without delay, and the senator unwilling to let injustice pass unchallenged. He closed his eyes once more, whispering a prayer not for safety, but for strength. When he opened them again, the path was clear. This would not end in silence. The hum of the engines was steady, a rhythm as constant as a heartbeat. But inside the first-class cabin of North Star Flight 719, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Every pair of eyes, from rows 1 through 4, seemed to point in the same direction toward Seat 2A, where Senator Julian Hart sat tall, his hands resting quietly on his knees. Captain Peter Caldwell stood in the aisle, his uniform crisp, his expression hard to read. The Mercers leaned forward in their seats, playing the role of injured accusers with exaggerated precision. Elaine dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue, though no tears had formed. Gregory's jaw clenched with theatrical outrage. "Captain," Elaine said, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile. I don't feel safe knowing that a thief is sitting right in front of me. If my phone can be taken in first class, what does that say about the rest of this flight?" Passengers shifted uneasily, the unspoken words settling over them. "What does that say about people like him?" Julian inhaled, steady and deliberate. His inner voice whispered like a steady drum. "Stay calm. Stay anchored. Don't let them decide who you are." Captain Caldwell pinched the bridge of his nose, torn between expedience and fairness. He had flown for 20 years, and if there was one thing he knew, it was that the easiest solution usually became the official one. But as he looked at Julian, something in the man's composure unsettled him. There was strength there, the kind that did not belong to the guilty. Still, order had to be kept. Or at least, that's what Caldwell told himself. He stepped closer to Julian's row. "Sir," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I'm going to have to involve security when we land. It's standard procedure when a passenger refuses to cooperate with a search after an accusation." A ripple ran through the cabin. Words like security and accusation were heavy stones thrown into still water. Julian met the captain's eyes. "So that's it. I'm presumed guilty, unless I allow myself to be humiliated," Caldwell hesitated. His training had not prepared him for moral philosophy at 33,000 feet. "It's not about guilt, sir. It's about procedure." "Procedure," Julian repeated quietly, almost to himself. The word tasted bitter. He thought of every headline he had read about unjust procedures, about the way policies were often used to mask prejudice. He thought of his mother's words, etched into his memory. "The world will try to shrink you. Don't help it succeed." His pulse quickened. He wanted to shout, to stand, to tell them who he really was. He wanted to pull the mask away and let the title of senator crash over them like a wave. But another part of him, quieter and older, reminded him that power meant nothing if it was used only for personal vindication. He folded his hands tighter. "Do what you must, Captain, but I won't yield my dignity to appease their prejudice." Gregory seized the moment, raising his voice loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "See, that's the problem. He thinks he's above the rules. If he has nothing to hide, why not just prove it?" Elaine leaned forward, her words dripping with indignation. "We're not the villains here. We're the victims. And if this airline has any respect for its paying customers, it will protect us." Alva Delgado flinched at the words. She had been standing nearby, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. She wanted to speak, to defend Julian, but the hierarchy of the cabin weighed on her. Flight attendants supported captains, not passengers. Still, something in her chest ached at the unfairness of it all. She stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Captain, if I may, I've searched the Mercer's row thoroughly. The phone wasn't found. We shouldn't jump to conclusions about another passenger." Elaine's head snapped toward her. "Are you accusing me of lying?" "No, ma'am," Ava replied quickly, her palms sweating. "I'm simply saying we don't know yet. And Mr. Hart has been nothing but respectful." Julian felt a flicker of gratitude for her words, though he could see the fear in her eyes. She was risking her own standing to speak a sliver of truth. Captain Caldwell raised a hand, silencing further debate. "Enough. I'll make the call. Airport police will meet us at the gate in Washington. Until then, everyone remains seated and calm." The weight of his words settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Elaine leaned back with a satisfied sigh, as though justice were already hers. Gregory smirked, muttering something under his breath about teaching lessons. Julian closed his eyes again. the roar of the engines merging with the roar inside his mind. He pictured his mother's face, pale and fragile, waiting for him. He thought of the shame she would feel if she knew her son had been accused like this. But he also thought of her pride, the way she had always told him to stand firm, even when the world wanted him small. His inner dialogue wrestled comply and end this quickly, refuse and risk everything. Each choice carried consequences, not just for him, but for the principles he lived by. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me," came a gentle whisper from across the aisle. Julian opened his eyes. "Doctor?" Layla Chen leaned toward him, her eyes filled with both concern and resolve. "I'm a witness," she said quietly, almost conspiratorially. "I see what's happening, and I won't let this story be told without the truth." Her words struck him like a lifeline. He gave the slightest nod, the kind of acknowledgement shared between two strangers bound by principle. A row behind her. Miles Parker's phone captured everything. The Mercer's accusations, the captain's declaration, Julian's quiet defiance. The red recording light glowed like a small beacon in the dark, unseen by those too focused on their own certainty. Julian sat back in his seat, exhaling slowly. Whatever storm awaited at the gate, he was no longer facing it alone. The cabin grew quieter, though the tension was far from gone. Passengers leaned into whispered conversations. Some shook their heads, disapproving of Julian's refusal. Others avoided eye contact, preferring the comfort of silence. Julian felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, the judgment, the suspicion, the quiet complicity of those who chose to look away. Yet beneath the heaviness, a strange clarity formed. He had spent his career fighting battles in chambers and committee rooms. Now, here in the sky, he was fighting the same battle in miniature dignity against prejudice, truth against assumption. The engines droned on, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the cabin. Clouds stretched endlessly outside the window, pure and untainted. Inside, humanity revealed its flaws with startling clarity. Julian folded his hands once more, whispering under his breath a prayer not for himself, but for courage that he might hold steady when the storm finally broke upon landing. And miles below, Washington waited. So did his mother, and so did the police. The descent began with a subtle tilt, the nose of the aircraft angling downward as Washington came into view beneath scattered clouds. The familiar ding of the seatbelt sign broke the thick silence of the first-class cabin. Passengers straightened in their seats, some eager to leave, others dreading the chaos waiting at the gate. Julian Hart sat motionless, hands folded tightly, his gaze fixed on the clouds drifting past the window. Each mile closed the distance between him and his mother. Each mile also brought him closer to the trial that awaited him just beyond the jet bridge. Elaine Mercer reapplied her lipstick in the reflection of her compact mirror, her face composed but smug. Gregory leaned back with a self-satisfied sigh, as though justice were already assured. Their whispers floated forward, too soft for words, but sharp enough in tone to sting. Julian heard them anyway. He always did. He carried the weight of unspoken slights as easily as he carried the visible ones. When the plane touched down, the wheels hitting the runway with a jolt, a ripple of tension ran through the cabin. The engines roared in reverse thrust, before settling into a steady deceleration. Washington National appeared outside the window, a city that had always been both battlefield and sanctuary for Julian. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Caldwell announced, "welcome to Washington. Local time is 10:37 ma'am. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off." Security will be meeting us at the gate for assistance. The words landed with the finality of a gavel strike. Elaine leaned toward Gregory, her whisper sharp but audible. Finally. Maybe then we can feel safe. Julian closed his eyes briefly, pressing the back of his head against the leather headrest. He felt the urge to reveal himself, to shatter their certainty with a single sentence. I am a U.S. Senator. But he resisted. If he revealed it too soon, the moment would be about shock value, not truth. He wanted the world to see what dignity looked like before power entered the room. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and the rustle of passengers retrieving bags filled the air. But in first class, no one stood. Everyone waited, breath held, for what was about to happen. The door opened with a hiss, and two figures appeared in the entryway. Officer Marco Ruiz, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression already set in stone, and Sergeant Dana Whitaker, whose sharp eyes scanned the cabin with practiced caution. Ava Delgado stepped quickly toward them, her voice low but urgent. The complaint came from passengers in row 3. They've accused the gentleman in 2A of theft. I searched the area. No phone was found. Ruiz barely nodded, his gaze already fixed on Julian. Sir, we need you to step off the plane with us. Julian didn't move. His hands remained folded. On what grounds? Ruiz's tone hardened. On the grounds of a passenger complaint. We can resolve this quietly at the gate. Gregory raised his voice, loud enough for the cabin. There's no need for politeness. He stole it. We all know it, Elaine added. This is what happens when standards are lowered. First class isn't what it used to be. The words pierced the cabin like shards of glass. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Most stayed silent. Silence, Julian thought bitterly. Was complicity wearing politeness as a mask? Dr. Layla Chen could no longer remain still. She rose from her seat, her journal clutched tightly. Officers, I've been here the entire flight. I saw nothing to suggest this man took anything. What I did see was two passengers creating a narrative based on nothing but prejudice. Ruiz turned, his brows furrowed. Ma'am, please sit down. We'll handle this. But Layla didn't sit. Her voice gained strength. Handle it. You're about to drag a man off a plane in front of everyone without evidence. That's not handling it. That's enabling it. Julian felt a swell of gratitude, though he remained seated. His dignity demanded that he not plead. If others saw the truth, let them speak it. Miles Parker's phone was angled carefully, recording every second. His hands trembled, but his resolve didn't. He knew this footage mattered. It wasn't just content, it was witness. Officer Ruiz took a step closer, his hand hovering near his cuffs. Sir, if you refuse to come willingly, we'll have to escort you forcibly. Julian raised his eyes slowly, meeting Ruiz's stare with calm steel. And what exactly am I being charged with? Possessing no evidence, refusing to surrender my dignity. Tell me, officer, is that in your manual? The words rippled through the cabin, quiet but seismic. For the first time, Sergeant Whitaker spoke. Her voice was cool, measured. Marco, slow down. Let's think. We don't even know if there's a crime here. Elaine's face flushed with fury. Are you kidding me? Look at him. Look how defensive he is. Julian turned toward her, his voice firm, but even. No, ma'am. Look at me. Look at how calm I've remained while being accused, searched with eyes, judged by whispers, and declared guilty without proof. That is not defensiveness. That is dignity. A hush followed, thick and heavy. Even the Mercers faltered, their words caught in their throats. Whitaker studied Julian carefully, something in his composure striking her as unusual. She had dealt with belligerent passengers, entitled passengers, frightened passengers. But this man radiated something different, something unshakable. "Let's at least ask the accusers to empty their own bags," Whitaker said suddenly. Elaine's face twisted. "What? That's absurd. Why would we need to? We're the ones missing something." "Because fairness goes both ways," Whitaker replied evenly. Gregory barked a laugh. "This is ridiculous. We're respected customers. We don't need to prove ourselves." Julian's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Interesting. That's exactly what you demanded of me." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Some passengers nodded subtly. Others frowned. A line had been drawn, and the illusion of consensus began to crack. Officer Ruiz, still tense, looked between Whitaker and the Mercers, unsure which path to follow. Procedure told him to remove Julian. Something deeper told him the situation wasn't so simple. Julian sat unmoving, his voice quiet but resolute. "I will walk off this plane with you if you insist. But know this: when I step onto that jet bridge, I carry not only myself, but the truth of what has happened here, and the world will hear it." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Whitaker's eyes narrowed, suspicion mixing with curiosity. Something told her this man was not who the Mercers thought he was. Ava Delgado swallowed hard, then whispered under her breath, almost a prayer, "Please let the truth come out." The engines hummed softly, indifferent to the storm in the cabin. Outside, the jet bridge was locked in place, waiting. Inside, the battle lines were drawn, accusation against dignity, silence against courage. Julian rose slowly from his seat, his posture tall, his gaze unbroken. The storm had reached its heart, and as he stepped into the narrow aisle, the camera in Miles Parker's trembling hand caught the moment the world was about to see. The jet bridge hissed against the aircraft door, a metallic groan that seemed to echo the tension in the cabin. Officer Marco Ruiz stood firm, his hand resting on the cuffs clipped to his belt. Sergeant Dana Whitaker lingered beside him, her sharp eyes flicking between Julian Hart and the Mercers, measuring every word, every movement. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, curiosity pulling them closer to the drama unfolding just feet away. The hum of the engine softened as the crew powered down systems, but inside first class, the pressure only grew louder. "Sir," Ruiz said, voice clipped, "we're not going to ask again. Step off the plane with us now." Julian rose slowly, his movements deliberate, unhurried. His tall frame filled the aisle, his posture unbowed. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the silence breathe, letting the weight of the moment settle on every witness. Behind him, Elaine Mercer's lips curled into a smile of satisfaction. She whispered to Gregory, "Finally, they'll see." Gregory's voice rumbled back, "About time." Julian turned his head slightly, enough to catch their faces in his peripheral vision. He did not glare. He did not scowl. His expression was calm, almost serene. And then he spoke not loudly, not angrily, but with a quiet authority that cut through the air sharper than any shout. "Before you put your hands on me," he said, looking squarely at Ruiz, "there is something you need to know." The cabin stilled. Even Ava Delgado froze in place, her tray clasped tightly against her chest. Julian reached slowly into his pocket, withdrawing a slim leather wallet. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he opened it, revealing a gleaming identification card embossed with the seal of the United States Senate. He held it high enough for the officers to see, his voice unwavering. "My name," he said, "is Julian Hart. I am a sitting United States Senator for the state of Georgia." The words hit the cabin like thunder rolling across a plain. Gas erupted. A muffled exclamation came from somewhere in row 4. Miles Parker's phone shook in his hands as he tried to steady the camera, realizing his video had just transformed from a simple confrontation to breaking news. Officer Ruiz blinked, his hand dropping away from the cuffs instinctively. Sergeant Whitaker's lips parted, her sharp composure cracking for the first time. She stepped closer, studying the ID with careful eyes. There was no mistaking the seal, no mistaking the face that matched perfectly with the man standing tall before them. Gregory Mercer's mouth hung open, words stuck in his throat. Elaine's face drained of color, the smugness vanishing as though someone had pulled a rug from beneath her. Julian let the silence stretch, let the realization sink deep into every corner of the cabin. Then he spoke again, his tone still calm but edged with the weight of truth. "I have been accused without evidence, judged without reason, declared guilty without proof, not by law, not by justice, but by prejudice." His gaze swept the cabin, meeting the eyes of strangers who had chosen silence. "And all of you witnessed it. Doctor?" Layla Chen rose slowly from her seat, her voice steady now. "Yes, we did. Every word, every look. We saw it." A murmur rippled through the cabin, passengers shifting uncomfortably, some nodding, others looking down at their hands. Silence no longer protected them. Silence now condemned them. Julian turned back to Ruiz and Whitaker. "So tell me, officers, are you going to drag a United States Senator off this plane in handcuffs because a wealthy couple decided I looked guilty enough?" Ruiz swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Whitaker for guidance. She stepped forward, her voice careful. "Senator Hart, with all respect, this situation was not made clear to us. Had we known Julian cut her off gently but firmly, that is exactly the point. You did not need to know my title to treat me with dignity. My humanity was enough. But it wasn't respected." His words struck like iron on an anvil. Ava Delgado's throat tightened as tears pricked at her eyes. She had wanted to speak earlier, to defend him more strongly, but fear of consequence had held her back. Now she felt the full weight of that hesitation. Elaine found her voice at last, trembling but desperate. We didn't know who you were." Julian turned to her, his eyes piercing but calm. "And if I weren't a senator, what then would your lie have been truth enough? Would my silence have been my conviction?" Elaine's lips quivered. Gregory shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders hunched. For the first time, the Mercers looked small, their wealth and entitlement stripped of their power. Julian tucked his ID back into his wallet, sliding it into his pocket. His movements were precise, final, as though placing the truth back where it belonged. Then he stepped forward, past the stunned officers, past the open door of the plane. At the threshold, he paused, turning back to the cabin filled with silent faces. "Remember this," he said softly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout. "Justice delayed is dignity denied. Do not wait for someone's title before you decide they deserve respect." The silence that followed was absolute. He turned and stepped onto the jet bridge, his stride steady, his head held high. Ruiz and Whitaker followed, no longer his captors, but his shadows. Ava watched him go, her chest tight with something between shame and admiration. In row 4, Miles Parker stopped recording only when his hands began to shake too violently to keep the camera steady. He looked down at the footage, realizing he had captured a story that would soon belong to the whole nation. and in the seats behind, Gregory and Elaine Mercer sat frozen, their faces pale, their champagne untouched. The smug certainty that had carried them through the flight had dissolved, leaving only the hollow echo of their own prejudice. First class was quieter than it had ever been. Julian Hart walked down the jet bridge, not as a man accused, but as a man revealed. The jet bridge was cold compared to the warmth of the cabin, its metallic walls humming faintly as passengers filed out behind him. Senator Julian Hart walked with measured steps, his head high, his stride even. The officers followed a pace behind, their silence louder than any words they might have spoken. Waiting near the gate were two more security personnel, their hands resting near their belts, prepared for confrontation. But when they saw the senator's identification in Whitaker's hand, their expressions faltered. They had expected trouble. Instead, they were met with truth. Julian paused at the end of the jet bridge, where sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the terminal. He turned, looking first at the officers. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. You are prepared to treat me as a criminal based on nothing more than an accusation. Ask yourselves how many others have you treated the same way, who didn't have the power of a title to protect them. The question struck deeper than blame. It left Rui shifting uncomfortably, his eyes falling to the ground. Whitaker, though steady, felt the sting of it too. She was a woman of the law, yet she knew the truth in his words. Behind them, passengers began to spill out of the jet bridge into the terminal, their voices hushed. Some stole glances at Julian, their expressions a mixture of shame and awe. Others avoided his gaze altogether, retreating quickly as though distance could erase their complicity. Elaine and Gregory Mercer emerged last, their posture wilted. Elaine clutched her designer handbag as though it might shield her from judgment. Gregory's jaw was tight, his pride struggling to hold against the weight of humiliation. They tried to walk past quickly, but Julian's voice followed them, quiet but clear. You wanted the world to see me as guilty? The world will see, but not the way you hoped. Elaine flinched, her cheeks flushing. Gregory muttered something under his breath, but no words of defiance came. Their silence spoke volumes. Dr. Layla Chen stepped off the jet bridge next, her journal still in her hand. She walked directly to Julian, her voice steady and strong. Senator, I'll testify to everything I witnessed. The bias, the false assumptions, the way the accusation shifted once you stood your ground. People need to understand how this happens every day. Julian gave her a small nod. Thank you, Doctor. Truth needs witnesses as much as it needs courage. Not far behind. Miles Parker hovered nervously with his phone still clutched tight. He looked at Julian, wide-eyed, as though uncertain if he should step forward. Julian noticed him, offering the faintest of smiles. You recorded, didn't you? Miles swallowed hard, nodding. Yes, sir. Then you hold something powerful, Julian said. Use it wisely, not for spectacle, but for truth. Miles nodded again, his throat dry, realizing the weight of what he carried. Ava Delgado emerged from the jet bridge last of the crew. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She approached Julian cautiously, almost trembling. Senator Hart, she said softly, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up more. I should have done better. Julian looked at her with kindness, though his expression was tinged with sorrow. You were caught in a system designed to keep order, not justice. Remember this moment. Ms. Delgado. Next time, your voice may be the difference. Ava's lips quivered. She nodded, her chest tightening as tears threatened again. The terminal was alive now, whispers spreading as word traveled quickly from one passenger to another. People glanced at Julian, some snapping quick photos, others murmuring his name. The story was no longer contained in the cabin. It was spilling outward into the waiting world. Whitaker stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Senator Hart, the airline will want to speak with you. They'll issue an apology, I'm sure." Julian's gaze was steady. "An apology to me means little. What about the next man or woman who doesn't carry a title, who apologizes to them?" The words hung in the air, heavy with undeniable truth. Elaine Mercer's voice cracked as she spoke at last. We didn't mean." Julian turned toward her, his eyes sharp. "You meant every word. You just didn't expect consequences. That's the difference." Elaine's lips snapped shut. Gregory tugged her arm, urging her away. His face flushed red with shame. They disappeared into the crowd of the terminal, but whispers followed them like shadows. Julian exhaled slowly, his chest heavy. He thought of his mother waiting in her hospital bed, frail and fading. He thought of her voice, the lessons she had planted deep within him. Dignity is not given by others. It is claimed by the self. He turned back to the officers. "I'll go now. My family needs me. But know this today was not about me. It was about all of us. And the choices we make when prejudice stands in front of us will define us more than any badge or uniform ever could." Whitaker lowered her head slightly, a gesture of respect. Rui said nothing, his silence carrying more guilt than words. Julian adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder and began walking through the terminal. The crowd parted around him, a strange mix of awe and shame shaping their faces. Miles followed at a distance, clutching the phone that held evidence of the entire ordeal. Layla Chen watched him go, scribbling a final note in her journal. Power did not protect him. His dignity did. As Julian walked toward the exit, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, reading a message from his sister. "She's asking for you. Please come soon." His chest tightened, but his steps did not falter. Today he had been accused, humiliated, and nearly dragged off a plane. But he had also stood, revealed, and reminded the world that dignity was not negotiable. The echoes of the terminal faded behind him as he stepped into the sunlight beyond the glass doors. Washington awaited him, his mother, his family, his responsibilities, and now a nation that would soon hear his story. The ride from the airport to the hospital passed in a blur. Senator Julian Hart sat in the back of a government sedan, his gaze fixed on the monuments of Washington as they slipped by the window, marble and stone, symbols of power and permanence. But in his chest, the weight of the morning pressed heavy. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Dozens of notifications filled the screen. Missed calls, messages, news alerts. Miles Parker's shaky video had already escaped into the digital bloodstream, uploaded within minutes of landing. It was spreading faster than wildfire in dry grass. Julian finally opened one of the links forwarded by his aide. The headline glared in bold: "Black senator accused of theft on first-class flight passenger video tells another story." The video played. He saw himself on screen, calm and steady even as accusations swirled. He heard Gregory's booming voice, Elaine's sharp tone, Ruiz's clipped commands. And then he watched as he revealed his Senate identification. The collective gasp of the cabin echoed through the recording, raw and unfiltered. Beneath the video were comments pouring in by the thousands. Some expressed outrage, others shame, many praise. This is what black travelers face every day. Dignity personified. The Mercers should be banned from flying forever. Imagine if he hadn't been a senator, what would have happened then? Julian closed the app, sliding the phone into his pocket. The praise did not ease the ache. The outrage did not erase the humiliation. And none of it mattered compared to the thought of his mother waiting for him in a quiet hospital room. Still, he knew the story was no longer just his. It had become a mirror held up to a nation. At that very moment, Gregory and Elaine Mercer sat in their penthouse apartment, blinds drawn tight against the outside world. Phones rang endlessly, journalists camped outside the lobby, and social media drowned in their names. Elaine scrolled through a sea of condemnation, her face pale. Gregory paced like a caged animal, muttering about lawsuits and spin. But the video left little room for spin. Every word they had spoken was captured. Every sneer, every insinuation. Elaine pressed her palms to her face. "Greg, what have we done?" Gregory snapped back. "What he did was play us. He set us up. But even he knew the truth. They hadn't been set up. They had been exposed." Back at the hospital, Julian finally reached his mother's bedside. Evelyn Hart's eyes fluttered open when she heard his voice. He clasped her hand gently, his throat tight with emotion. For a few precious minutes, the world outside didn't exist. It was only mother and son, the warmth of her frail hand grounding him in something deeper than politics or scandal. Later that evening, as the city lights glittered beyond the hospital window, Julian's aides arrived with urgent updates. News networks were running the story on a loop. Editorials framed the incident as a symbol of systemic bias. Civil rights groups issued statements praising his composure. Airline executives, under mounting pressure, drafted a public apology. Julian listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't interested in apologies crafted by legal departments. He wasn't seeking personal vindication. He wanted something larger, something lasting. He asked his aides, "How many stories like this go unseen? How many people get dragged off planes without a camera to defend them, without a title to protect them?" Silence followed. They knew the answer. Too many. Meanwhile, Miles Parker sat in his bedroom, the glow of his laptop illuminating his young face. His video had amassed millions of views, news anchors quoting his name as the teen who recorded history. His hand still trembled when he replayed the footage. He hadn't meant to change anything. He had only wanted to capture what felt unfair. But now, he was part of something much larger. His friends flooded him with messages. "You're famous. You're trending. Dude, CNN is quoting you," but beneath the excitement, Miles felt the same heaviness Julian had felt. This wasn't entertainment. It was testimony. Dr. Layla Chen, sitting at her desk surrounded by stacks of papers, began drafting an op-ed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she wrote, "What happened on Flight 719 is not an isolated incident. It is the lived reality of countless travelers who navigate the skies with the added burden of suspicion. Senator Hart's dignity may have revealed the prejudice of a few, but it reflects the experience of many." Her words poured from both academic precision and personal outrage. She knew her voice could amplify the senator's calm defiance into something larger, a conversation the country could no longer ignore. As midnight approached, Julian sat in the hospital's quiet lounge, his phone buzzing again. This time it was a call from Captain Caldwell. He hesitated before answering. "Senator Hart," the captain began, his voice tight. "I wanted to apologize personally. I should have handled the situation differently." Julian listened, his silence heavy on the line. Caldwell stumbled on. I thought I was following procedure. But in truth, I failed you. I let the loudest voices steer me instead of the right one. Julian finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Captain, I don't need your apology for myself. I need you to change. The next time you hear an accusation like that, remember today. Remember what silence almost cost me. And remember what dignity looks like when you see it. Caldwell swallowed audibly. Yes, sir, I will. When the call ended, Julian leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him. His mind replayed every moment of the flight, every glance, every accusation. He thought of the Mercers, sitting in silence somewhere, their privilege finally pierced. He thought of Ava Delgado, her whispered apology in the terminal. And he thought of the millions of strangers now watching his ordeal on screens across the nation. His dignity had carried him through the storm, but now it was no longer his alone. It belonged to the people who saw themselves in him, who carried their own stories of humiliation and silence. Julian closed his eyes, whispering a prayer for strength. Tomorrow, the world would expect him to speak, to lead, to transform pain into purpose. And he would, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. By morning, the nation had already chosen its sides. Every news station replayed the same shaky footage from Flight 719. Social media pulsed with hashtags "Honor Dignity in the Sky," "Flying While Black," "Senator Hart." Reporters swarmed the steps of the Capitol before the sun had fully risen. Their cameras pointed toward the entrance where they knew Senator Julian Hart would appear. Aides had begged him to wait, to let the outrage breathe a little longer before responding. But Julian knew silence could be mistaken for shame. And shame was something he refused to carry. At precisely 9 o'clock, he stepped out onto the marble steps, a simple navy suit replacing the plain clothes of the day before. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of sleepless hours and a nation's expectation. The crowd of journalists erupted in questions, voices overlapping like crashing waves. Senator Hart, do you plan to sue the airline senator? What's your response to the Mercers' claim they were simply concerned passengers? Senator, do you think your race played a role in the accusation? Julian raised a hand, his gesture enough to quiet the frenzy. When he spoke, his voice carried not just across the press corps, but across the nation watching live. Yesterday, I boarded a plane as a son rushing to see his mother. I wore no suit, carried no title, asked for no recognition. I sat quietly in my seat, like any other traveler. And yet, I was accused without evidence, without reason of theft, not because of what I did, but because of what I look like. The murmurs quieted into a profound silence. Cameras zoomed closer. Every word etched itself into history. Julian continued, steady and clear. When I refused to surrender my dignity, I was threatened with removal, treated as if silence equaled guilt. It was only when I revealed my title Senator of the United States that the accusations began to crumble. Ask yourself what would have happened if I had been anyone else. What if I had not carried a title? Would I have been dragged off in handcuffs? Another nameless headline buried beneath excuses. He paused, letting the question settle. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to catch the weight of his words. This is not about me, Julian said, his voice rising now, conviction flowing through him. This is about every traveler who has ever been presumed guilty before being seen as human. This is about the quiet injustice that happens in airports, in classrooms, in neighborhoods, where dignity is demanded to be proved instead of presumed. And this is about a truth we must face. Prejudice is not always shouted. Sometimes it is whispered. Sometimes it is dressed as procedure. And sometimes it hides behind wealth and entitlement. But its damage is the same. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some reporters lowered their eyes, feeling the sting of their own complicity in perpetuating narratives. Others leaned forward, captivated. Julian's gaze swept across the sea of cameras. I am calling for accountability, not for myself, but for every person who cannot stand at this podium, for those who are humiliated in silence because no one records their story, for those who do not have the privilege of revealing a title to protect their dignity, and for those whose lives are changed forever because prejudice was mistaken for truth. A swell of applause rose from the back. Not from the press, but from citizens who had gathered at the edges of the crowd, holding handwritten signs, "We stand with Hart. Dignity has no title." Julian allowed himself the faintest smile before finishing. I will not seek vengeance, but I will seek change. And I ask all of you, when you see prejudice in action, will you be silent or will you speak? The answer to that question will define the kind of nation we are. With that, he stepped back, refusing to take further questions. His aides quickly surrounded him, guiding him toward the Capitol doors. But the words lingered in the air long after he was gone. Across the city, televisions in bars, restaurants, and homes replayed the speech. Some cheered, others debated. In one penthouse apartment, Elaine Mercer sat frozen on the couch, the senator's words replaying in her mind like an indictment. Gregory stalked across the room, fuming. He's turning this into a crusade. Gregory muttered, "We'll be destroyed." Elaine's voice was a whisper. Maybe we should be. At the airline's headquarters, executives huddled in a sterile boardroom, their faces pale. The brand's logo flashed across screens as PR advisors outlined the fallout: boycotts, petitions, mounting calls for systemic reform. One executive asked, "How do we contain this?" Another answered, "We don't. We adapt, or we fall." Meanwhile, in a quiet bedroom, Miles Parker sat at his desk, still stunned by the storm his video had unleashed. His inbox overflowed with interview requests. His phone buzzed nonstop, but all he could think about was the look on Senator Hart's face when he said, "Use it wisely, not for spectacle, but for truth," Miles whispered to himself. "I will, Senator, I promise." Dr. Layla Chen's op-ed was published the same morning. Its title blazed across the homepage of national outlets: "Prejudice at 30,000 feet is still prejudice." Her words dissected the event, placing it in a broader pattern of systemic bias. Readers flooded the comment sections with their own stories, sharing moments of humiliation that had never made the news. Back at the hospital, Evelyn Hart watched her son's speech on the small television mounted in her room. Her frail hand clutched Julian's as he sat beside her, her voice weak but proud. "Your father would have been so proud of you. You stood tall. Julian, you reminded them who you are, not just a senator, but a man who refuses to bow." Julian squeezed her hand gently, tears pricking at his eyes. "I only did what you raised me to do." The nation moved with the rhythm of his words. His dignity had become a symbol, his calm defiance a rallying cry. Yet beneath the noise, Julian remained grounded in something simpler, a son holding his mother's hand, grateful for the chance to be beside her. And as the day turned to evening, one truth settled over him. The flight was over, but the journey it had begun was only just taking off. The morning after Senator Hart's speech, the country awoke to a storm. Newspapers splashed his face across their front pages, headlines painting him as both victim and symbol. On talk shows, pundits dissected his words, some praising his dignity, others questioning why he hadn't revealed his identity sooner. For the Mercers, the fallout was brutal. Their names trended online, not in admiration, but in ridicule. Their once glittering reputation in Washington's social circles began to crumble overnight. Elaine sat in the corner of their lavish living room, staring blankly at her phone. Hundreds of messages filled her inbox, angry strangers calling her a bigot, former friends distancing themselves with silence. Gregory stormed back and forth across the room, shouting into his phone at their attorney. "We were concerned, passengers. That's all. This is being blown out of proportion. There has to be a way to control this narrative." But no matter how many calls he made, no matter how many excuses he rehearsed, the video spoke louder, his booming voice accusing, Elaine's sharp tone insisting, the smug certainty in their words. It was all immortalized online, replayed endlessly without the filter of privilege. Elaine finally whispered, her voice hollow, "Greg, what if this is who we really are, and now the world sees it?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Meanwhile, at North Star Air's headquarters, executives huddled in tense meetings. Charts of falling stock prices and angry customer petitions covered the walls. The CEO, a man who had once prided himself on smooth operations, rubbed his temples as advisors debated damage control. "We need to issue a stronger statement." One suggested. "No," countered another. "We need action, not just words. A task force on racial bias in air travel, mandatory training for crew, a review of procedures. But if we admit bias, we open ourselves to lawsuits." Another chimed in. The CEO slammed his hand on the table, silencing them. "We're already exposed. The only question now is whether we lead change or get buried by it." That evening, North Star Air released a statement promising sweeping reforms, independent investigations into bias-related complaints, enhanced training for staff, and a direct apology to Senator Hart. But Julian, reading the statement from his mother's hospital room, felt only a quiet skepticism. "They don't need apologies," he said softly to his aide. "They need transformation. And that doesn't come from press releases." His mother stirred, her frail voice breaking his thoughts. "Julian," she whispered, "don't let them turn you into just a headline. You are more than this story." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know, Mama, but maybe this story can help others. Maybe it can force change." She looked at him with tired but proud eyes. "Change begins with one heart at a time. But remember, you are still my son before you are their senator." Her words cut deep. He had been thrust into the center of a national storm. But at the core, he was still the boy she had raised, the man she had taught to hold dignity above all else, elsewhere in the city. Miles Parker sat in his bedroom, staring at the numbers on his screen. 10 million views, then 12, then 15. His phone buzzed with requests from news outlets, documentary filmmakers, activists. He had become, almost overnight, the accidental chronicler of a national reckoning, but the weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. "I just wanted to capture what was happening." He confessed to his mother over dinner. "I didn't mean to start all this." His mother reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "Sometimes the truth doesn't ask for permission. Sometimes it just demands to be seen. You gave the world eyes." In her office, Dr. Lala Chen was flooded with messages from strangers thanking her for her op-ed. Students emailed her stories of humiliation at airports. Colleagues invited her to panels on systemic bias. She felt the surge of a movement forming, and yet she too carried the weight of what she had witnessed. She wrote late into the night. Senator Hart did not just reveal his title. He revealed the cost of silence and the danger of assumptions. The lesson is not that power protects dignity. The lesson is that dignity must be defended even when power is absent. Julian read her piece the next morning, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. Her words echoed the truth he had tried to hold onto. Dignity was not negotiable. Yet as the days passed, he began to feel the burden of becoming a symbol. Reporters followed him everywhere. Strangers approached him on the street, thanking him, asking him to speak at rallies, pleading for him to share their stories. His aides scheduled interviews, appearances, Senate hearings. Late one evening, exhausted, he sat alone in his office overlooking the Capitol dome. The city lights glimmered beyond the window, but his thoughts turned inward. Am I losing myself to this story, he wondered. Will they ever see me as more than the man on that plane? He closed his eyes, hearing again the voices from the cabin. Elaine's sharp accusation, Gregory's booming demand, Ava's hesitant defense, the silence of strangers, and then, finally, his own words. Innocence does not need permission slips, and dignity is not negotiable. Those words had carried him through the storm, but now they bound him to a larger fight. In the shadows of their penthouse, the Mercers watched his speech again, the weight of public scorn pressing harder each day. Gregory seethed, blaming everyone but himself. Elaine, quieter now, sat by the window staring out at the city lights. He showed us, she whispered. Not just the world. He showed us, for the first time. Gregory had no retort. Back in his office, Julian opened a drawer and pulled out a framed photograph of his father, long gone, but never forgotten. He set it gently on his desk. Dad, he murmured, I didn't ask for this fight, but I won't run from it. He straightened the frame, letting the quiet strength of his father's gaze settle him. The burden was heavy. Yes, but it was not unbearable, because it was not carried alone. Across the country, millions had taken up the weight with him, and together they were forcing a reckoning. The Senate chamber was hushed that morning, an unusual stillness settling over the hall where arguments usually rang sharp and loud. Senators filled their seats, staffers lined the edges, and the gallery brimmed with citizens who had come to witness not another bill or debate, but a man who had become the embodiment of a national conversation. Julian Hart sat at his desk near the front, his hands folded loosely, his expression calm, but his chest heavy. The polished wood, the tall marble columns, the weight of history pressing from every angle. It all felt familiar. Yet today it carried a different charge. Today, he was not just Senator Hart. Today, he was the man from Flight 719. The presiding officer gavelled the chamber to order. The senator from Georgia is recognized. Julian rose slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. As he walked to the podium, the chamber leaned forward collectively, breaths held in anticipation. He placed his notes on the lectern but did not look down. Instead, he lifted his gaze, letting his eyes sweep the room. Colleagues, he began, his voice steady but resonant. I stand here not to recount the duties of this chamber or the details of legislation. I stand here as a man who boarded a plane to see his ailing mother and was accused of theft before I had spoken a word. The silence deepened. Some senators shifted uncomfortably. Others fixed their eyes on him with sharp attention. I was accused, Julian continued, Not because of evidence, not because of action, but because of assumption, because prejudice whispers in the corners of our daily lives. And sometimes it speaks through the voices of those who believe their wealth or status gives them authority over truth. He paused, letting the words sink in. When I refused to yield my dignity, I was told I must comply for the sake of procedure. When I refused to surrender my humanity, I was told silence would make me safe. But silence does not keep us safe. Silence buries us. A murmur ran through the gallery. Julian pressed forward, his voice gaining power. It was only when I revealed my title, when I showed them I was a United States Senator, that the tide shifted. Suddenly, suspicion became apology. Suddenly, dignity was restored. And I ask you, what if I had not carried that title? What if I had been another black man, another traveler, another son on his way to see his mother? Would I have been dragged off that plane in handcuffs? Would I be standing here today? We all know the answer. He let his gaze linger on his colleagues, some nodding, some averting their eyes. This is not just about one flight, one senator, or one incident. This is about every citizen who was asked to prove their innocence instead of being granted it. This is about the systems we have built that confuse prejudice for procedure, that allow assumptions to masquerade as safety. Julian gripped the sides of the lectern, his voice steady, but his eyes burning. We cannot legislate respect, but we can legislate accountability. We can demand that airlines and institutions create systems that protect every traveler, not just those with titles. We can demand that training go beyond customer service and into confronting the biases that cloud judgment. And we can demand that when prejudice tries to disguise itself as procedure, there are safeguards to stop it. The chamber was silent, heavy with the weight of his words. Julian's throat tightened, but he pressed on. My mother taught me that dignity is not something given. It is something you hold, even when the world tries to take it. I held mine at 30,000 feet, but I should not have had to. No one should. He paused, his voice softening. This is personal to me, but it is not only personal. It is national. It is moral. It is the kind of test that reveals who we are not as senators, but as people. From the gallery, quiet applause began to ripple before it was hushed by the presiding officer. Still, the sound lingered, an echo of approval that carried beyond the chamber walls. Julian drew a breath, his final words steady and clear. We cannot wait for another video, another headline, another humiliation to force our hand. The time for excuses is over. The time for action is now. With that, he stepped back from the lectern. For a moment, the chamber remained still, as though uncertain how to follow such words. Then, slowly, applause rose not from all, but from enough to shake the walls of the chamber. Julian returned to his desk, his face calm but his heart pounding. He thought of his mother, resting in her hospital bed, perhaps watching the speech on television. He hoped she would feel proud. He hoped she would see not just a senator, but the son she had raised to hold dignity above all else. Later that evening, the footage of his speech was broadcast across every major network. Commentators praised his poise. Activists rallied behind his call for reform. And citizens across the country shared the clip with words like "finally." Someone said it. But behind the applause and headlines, Julian sat in his office alone. The Capitol dome glowed against the night sky, but his thoughts drifted back to the cabin of Flight 717, to the humiliation of those first moments. He replayed them not to relive the pain, but to remind himself why he could not let this end with applause. Change was slow. He knew. It was a grind of policy and resistance, of small victories and bitter setbacks. But dignity was not a luxury to be delayed. It was a necessity. And he had promised himself he would not let the moment slip into memory without transformation. As the clock ticked past midnight, he whispered to the empty room, "Mama, I will carry this fight. For me, for everyone who cannot stand here and somewhere in the quiet of a hospital room." Evelyn's heart stirred in her sleep. Her son's words carried through the television, her pride steady even in her frailty. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of machines and the soft rustle of curtains swaying against the window. Sunlight spilled across the floor in thin, golden stripes. Senator Julian Hart sat at his mother's bedside, her hand cradled gently in his. Evelyn Hart's breathing was shallow, but her eyes opened as he leaned close. "I saw you," she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. "I saw you on that floor, speaking to them." Julian smiled faintly, his throat tightening. "I only spoke what you taught me, Mama. That dignity isn't borrowed. It's held." Her lips curved into the softest smile. "Your father would have been proud. He'd say you carried not just your name, but all of ours." Julian closed his eyes briefly, pressing his forehead against her hand. For all the speeches, the cameras, the applause, this moment mattered most. Not the Senate floor, not the headlines, this. A son beside his mother, clinging to the roots that had shaped him. Outside the hospital, the world still churned with the story of Flight 719. News anchors analyzed every detail. Activists cited the incident in marches, and ordinary citizens debated it in coffee shops and classrooms. Miles Parker's video was now part of the cultural archive, a clip destined to be replayed in documentaries and history lessons. At North Star Air's headquarters, reforms had begun in earnest. New training programs were drafted. Independent oversight committees formed. But Julian knew this was only the beginning. A statement of intent was not a transformation. That would take persistence. That would take time. And for the Mercers, time felt like a punishment. Their names were now synonymous with prejudice. Their invitations rescinded from galas and boards. Gregory raged at the loss, blaming everyone but himself, while Elaine withdrew further each day, haunted by her own words replaying online. In one rare moment of honesty, she admitted to a friend over the phone, "We thought our voices would be believed no matter what. Now we're the ones no one will listen to." Back in the hospital, Julian's aides urged him to rest. His body was weary. His spirit stretched thin from days of speeches, interviews, and unrelenting attention, but he refused to leave his mother's side. Late into the evening, she stirred again, her hand tightening around his. "Julian," she murmured, "promise me something. Anything. Mama, when the noise fades, when the cameras move on, don't let the silence return. Keep speaking, not just for yourself, but for those who don't have your voice." His chest tightened. He nodded, tears slipping free. "I promise." She drifted back into sleep, her face peaceful. In the days that followed, Julian balanced two worlds. One was public meetings with airline executives, interviews with journalists, strategy sessions with fellow senators. The other was private quiet hours at the hospital, holding his mother's hand, whispering stories from his childhood, praying she would feel his presence even when words failed. The nation continued to wrestle with the meaning of Flight 719. Some praised Julian as a hero, a statesman of dignity. Others argued over whether one incident could symbolize something larger. But beneath the noise, Ordinary people began sharing their own stories, humiliations at security checkpoints, suspicions in first-class cabins, moments when silence felt like surrender. Julian read many of them late at night, scrolling through messages from strangers. He felt their pain, their anger, their hope, and though the burden was heavy, he reminded himself that carrying it was part of the promise he had made not just to his mother, but to everyone who could not stand at a podium. One evening, as he left the hospital after a long visit, a young man approached him nervously. It was Miles Parker, the teenager whose video had changed everything. His hands trembled as he held out his phone. "Senator, I just wanted to say thank you for trusting me, for reminding me this mattered." Julian smiled warmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just record what happened. Miles, you gave the truth a voice. Never forget that." Miles's eyes glistened as he nodded. "I won't." In another part of the city, Dr. Layla Chunt prepared to speak at a university forum. Her words had reached countless readers, but she knew the work was only beginning. "This is not a story about one senator," she told her students. "This is about a nation confronting the ways dignity is stolen in silence." Senator Hart held his ground. Now it is our turn. And across the country, people listened. The story had become more than a scandal. It had become a question. Who are we when prejudice speaks? And what will we do in response back in the hospital? Julian sat quietly as night settled in. His mother's breathing was slow, steady, fragile. He reached for his notebook and began writing not speeches, not policy proposals, but reflections about dignity, about silence, about the cost of standing tall in a world that wanted him small. He wrote of the cabin, the faces of passengers who said nothing, the officers who hesitated, the Mercers who accused. He wrote of Ava Delgado's tearful apology, of Miles's trembling courage, of Dr. Chen's unwavering clarity. And finally, he wrote of his mother, the source of his strength, the anchor of his dignity. When he finished, he closed the notebook gently and whispered, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning." The machines hummed softly in the background. Outside, the city lights shimmered like constellations. And in that quiet hospital room, Julian Hart found peace not in the noise of applause or the roar of headlines, but in the simple truth of a promise kept. He was a senator, yes. A public figure, yes. But before all else, he was a son, and that was enough. And so, the flight ended, but the echoes have never stopped. Senator Julian Hart walked off that plane carrying not just his own dignity, but the burden of every silent traveler who had been judged before being seen as human. His calm defiance became a mirror, forcing a nation to ask uncomfortable questions about prejudice, power, and silence. We are left with both sorrow and admiration. Sorrow for the humiliation he endured, admiration for the strength with which he carried it, and a reminder that respect, justice, and equality should never depend on titles, wealth, or privilege. But this story is not just about one man. It is about all of us, about whether we will remain silent when prejudice speaks, or whether we will stand, as Julian Hart did, with quiet, unshakable dignity. If this story touched your heart, let it move your hands. As well, click like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these conversations alive, honoring the voices of those silenced too long. Because this is not the end. This is only the beginning of a journey toward justice.